So for this week's Friday story, we're interviewing Phil Jakes. And before we get into it, I wanted to show you guys the river. This is the Rush River, and it's really important to this story and to Phil's life. So the Rush River Valley here, the Rush River feeds into the Mississippi, and they claim one of the best trout streams in the world. I'm not much of a fisherman, but it's a beautiful river and beautiful valley here. So, but I figured I better show you guys the river before we start. I just heard a fish jump out. So this is a big fly fishing river here. So, but yes, Phil has seen a lot in his years of growing up around the Rush River. He's 94 years old. So I think you guys will like this one. All right, so I'm here with Phil Jakes. And Phil, you're 94 years old.
Correct.
And you have been a farmer. You grew up on a farm.
Yes.
And you've been a farmer and a banker.
Yes.
For that your whole life here.
Yes, pretty much. Yes.
And we're down in the Rush River bottoms.
Right.
Where and you grew up around this farm we're on isn't your home farm where you grew up. You bought this, but you grew up right by this, right?
Yes. Yes. It connected to it.
Okay. So
So
then you were born in 1930?
30, correct.
So you were born right as the Depression was starting.
Yes. Yep. 29. The
crash of 29.
Yep. Yes.
And your folks were farmers.
Yes.
Were they dairy farmers then?
Yes. Dairy. They had dairy, a few pigs, chickens, geese.
Diversified farm.
Correct. Yes.
And we'll get into that too when we get into the banking and stuff. But diversification used to be the key to survival, wasn't it?
Right.
And we've somehow decided that that's a bad idea now.
Well, it's forced to be a bad idea, I guess, but yes.
Yep.
Yep.
So you were growing up in the Depression. Back then, so your milk, were you guys selling milk or selling cream?
Okay. We sold cream to begin with. The first, probably, I can remember the first, 6, 7 years, up till I was about 12 years old, we sold cream.
Where did the cream go?
To Ellsworth.
It did go to Ellsworth.
Well, yes. Ellsworth and Lawton. Lawton Creamery was.
Did Sathers own that then, or?
I do not know.
Okay.
I don't know.
But
I'm trying to think. I think most of the time we sold to Ellsworth. I think it was to Ellsworth.
Because there were a lot of little creameries and cheese plants around.
Oh, yes. Yes, there was.
But Ellsworth was, I think a lot of them ended up just going to Ellsworth eventually, right? Kind of like Lawton and that. Because that was by the bar there.
Yes,
right?
It was. Yep.
So you were selling cream, then I'm assuming feeding the skim milk to the hogs?
Correct. Yes.
And then the hogs, would they go to Sault Ste. Paul?
Well, yes. Butchered some, and yes.
Okay. So butchering some, I mean, obviously for yourself and for your family to eat.
Yes. That was always part of we butchered the hogs and, a couple for ourselves and usually a calf.
Yep.
For veal. We had veal. And then we had some geese, and so we always had
something that would chase the kids around the yard.
Yeah. But the geese were good. Like we ate them, and like Thanksgiving and Christmas, we always had a goose. And then we had a few chickens. And course, then in like 30, I think 38 or 39, then we had quite a few chickens. We went up to about 100 hens, which was quite a bit at that time.
Were you selling your eggs to the grocery store?
Well, we sold. There was routes that came around. Ellsworth had the Ellsworth hatchery. They bought eggs. There was 2 or 3 people in Ellsworth that bought eggs, and some of them had routes. They'd come around and pick it up once a week. They'd come around and pick up your eggs,
Okay.
and so eggs were pretty good. Matter of fact, at that time, I thought they were actually better than milk.
So the eggs were kind of a nice little side income.
Yes, and like in the 40s, I remember in the 40s, it was very good. We'd get as high as 35 cents a dozen, which was great. And the chickens were, in the 40s, we started having 300 and 400 hens.
Okay.
We had quite a few.
You had a pretty big coop then.
Yes, and we bought new chickens every year, Leghorns.
Oh, okay.
And we never kept them over 1 year.
Then you'd butcher them and.
Well, we just sell them off, and
Oh, okay.
and then the hatchery in Ellsworth would take them. And there was quite a few places that would take them. And but I know my dad. They had the production was always good. We'd get probably 75, 80%. They would lay.
Huh?
We'd get probably, if we had 350 chickens, we'd probably get 300 eggs a day, 275 to 300 eggs per day.
So at probably in the neighborhood of about 25 dozen, and 25 dozen eggs at 35 cents a dozen, you'd be talking so about $10 to $11 a day in eggs then.
Yep. Yeah. Well, it was, yeah. We'd sell usually about the 30 dozen cases, and about 6 or 7 per week usually.
Okay.
Cases per week.
What would the feed requirement? How many bushels of corn would it take to feed or were you feeding some oats to them too, or?
We had a mixture. We done a mixture, and then we'd take the corn and oats to town, and it wasn't Dyson Nugent at the time. I don't remember who it was, and had the feed ground and mixed, and had a regular mix. So it was a good. They were very efficient.
Yeah,
the chickens were very efficient, and I know the price at one time, I think, hit 60 or 65 cents a dozen. It was just way out of proportion, but it was just fantastic,
Yeah.
And so, eggs were chickens were good to us.
Yeah.
And but much better than cows. Dairy cows, they'd be freshening in March, which was the wrong time at that time. Should have had them freshening in the fall, but good production all summer and early fall, and of course then in the wintertime the production went down.
So you would seasonally calve the whole herd? So you wouldn't you'd actually dry them up you'd actually go 2 months without milking any cows then?
Well, usually there was always we always had milk, it seemed like, selling milk. They didn't all freshen at the same time.
You know, it's kind of funny, I was talking with somebody this week about that, I believe, or last week. And remember when we used to talk about the spring flush, for milk production. So June would hit. It was always kind of depressing to the milk prices because milk production would go up. They get on green grass and the milk production would go up, and then the kids got done with school. So that fluid milk demand went down. And it was always that new green grass, the spring flush. But I don't think many of the dairy cows today go out and graze anything.
No, we done that when I had dairy cows here myself. Our family, we'd have them freshen in the fall. Try to get most of them to freshen in the fall, and then they'd milk good during the winter, and then, like you say, in the spring, in middle of May or later part of May, we'd put them out to pasture, and June was very, very good, and into July. Of course, then July you started getting the heat.
Yep.
And then the grass pasture, a lot of times, if you didn't have perfect rains, then your pasture went down.
Yep.
And then then you had to feed, hay or else corn. Later in the fall, you'd feed chopped corn.
Well, they were probably getting ready for drying up at that point anyways, or tailing off in their lactation.
Yeah, you see, at that time, I can remember when the first herd hit 15,000 pound herd average.
Which is that'd be almost 15, that'd be about 50 pounds a day approximately.
Yeah, but just think now, that's probably 25, 30, it's doubled.
Oh yeah.
What it was then. And that was amazing. We thought 15,000 was just crazy.
Right.
To get that much production per year.
Well, so when did the chickens kind of taper off? Because obviously, so what I've always heard growing up was first they got the chickens, then they got the pigs. They took the independent chicken producers away, and then they took the independent hogs away, and, over the years. But when did you guys kind of quit selling eggs on a larger scale like that?
Well, my dad retired right around early 50s. And so that's when the chickens went.
Okay.
We didn't have any chickens anymore. Well, then he quit the cows and everything then. So.
Okay.
So the farming for us, it kind of went by the wayside then. So
then growing up, you had the dairy cattle and the diversified livestock farm, but were you able to finish school?
Yes. I went through grade school, country grade school. We didn't, and then went to high school. We had bus that picked us up. At that time, we lived up on top of the hill by Danny Fisher's. You know where Danny Fisher's repair? You go to the top of the hill, and then there was the second place on the right. That's where we lived at that time.
Oh, okay. So that's kind of over by where Dan's mom.
Yep. Yes.
Okay.
Yep. The next farm.
Yep.
On the right, and then there was Stanley Olson, and Elwood Nelson lived on the left.
Okay.
And then, of course, it used to be Borst, Earl Borst.
Yep.
I don't know if you remember him.
Oh, yeah.
Earl and Don, and
Yep.
And then, of course, Tom.
Yep.
He lives right up here. But that's where we lived. And my dad he never liked farming, so he wasn't a very good farmer because he came here from Czechoslovakia, and I think it was around probably 1908 or 1910. That's when he came over here, and he came from Czechoslovakia, and the conditions over there were not very good. And the incentive to work was not there. And he decided that this country would be much better, so he came over here. And then he went in the Army after he was here for a short while. But my dad done a lot of traveling. This is crazy, but when he came here, he started working in Minneapolis, and then first he came to Omaha, Nebraska. That's where he came. They were
Okay.
the sponsor. The sponsors lived in Omaha, Nebraska. So that's where he came, and then he went to Minneapolis. He worked, I think it was Brown and Bigelow, I think. But he worked there for a while, and then he went to Iowa. He worked on a farm in Iowa. He went out west, and I'm not sure exactly what states, whether it was the Dakotas, but he worked there a while. Then he went to St. Louis, Missouri, I think. He worked in the slaughterhouse there.
Yep.
And he went to Galveston, Texas. He worked in a hotel. He was a chef in a hotel in Galveston, Texas.
Huh.
And he traveled all over. Then he was in the Army, of course. Then he traveled again, and for about, for probably 12 years, he just roamed the country.
Yep.
And matter of fact, he rode on trains and stuff. And of course, back then, that was the way to travel, by trains.
Yeah. Was he in World War I then?
No, he wasn't. He was in at that time, but he was in the States. He didn't go.
Okay.
He didn't go. He was in the Army for a long time. I don't know exactly how many years, but quite a few years.
Okay.
And but he was a chef in the Army too. He officers' mess. He cooked for the officers.
So how did he end up here?
Well, my mother made some type of blanket or something, and he got that through I don't know what organization. So then he contacted my mother, and so they got together, and then he came here and courted her for a while, and then they got married.
And was she a farmer's daughter then?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
And she didn't have any much education or anything. But she did not, the only thing she liked was farming. Of course, that was her lifestyle at that time.
Yep.
And my dad, of course, he wanted to get a restaurant, but that just never did take place. But he never liked farming.
Oh, really?
No. He liked cooking.
Yep.
He was a fantastic cook. But in the family, he never done much, but I know he used to make wedding cakes, and I still remember he had the White House cookbook. They call it the White House cookbook.
Huh.
And that thing was so beat up, it was pathetic. And of course, he could make all the fancy meals. And,
Yep.
But no, he wanted to have a restaurant. That was his kind of a lifetime goal afterwards, but it just didn't work out. I think he could have done it. I think he would have been very successful, because he said there was 3 things that you had to do to be successful in owning a restaurant, is you had to have good food. He said, number 1, great food. You cannot have anything but great food. Good service and location. But he said location didn't mean that much, because they'd find you. If you had the food and the service, they'll find you.
Yeah.
And that was his theory. I can still remember that. He was a very, very intelligent man. He didn't have any education, but he could multiply 3-digit numbers and add, right in his head. He didn't need a pencil and paper to add. But he liked politics, but because I know we used to get the Chicago Tribune at the time, way, way back, and he liked that because he could get a lot of political news and world news and stuff. And
well, your brother Ed used to follow that kind of stuff. He was always pretty famous for writing in the Pierce County Herald, wasn't he?
And he was in the CCCs. He was in there for 2 years.
Okay.
And yep. yes.
Civilian Conservation Corps?
Yep, yep,
Okay.
yes.
So if your dad wasn't much of a farmer, you took a liking to it though?
Well, yes, you see, I grew up, I went to school, but I did not like school at all. I just, school is not my cup of tea. I'd never done well. I couldn't, it seemed like I couldn't comprehend. I could read a book and I didn't know what I read. It was just, I could read and if someone would talk, I could listen and I could understand and remember some, but reading just was not my cup of tea.
Okay.
And I did not do well in school. Matter of fact, I'd done very, very poorly. I did get through school. I got through school, but I just barely got through school. Then I went into the Army in 50. Well, before I went in the Army, I worked for a farmer over by Exile. Carl Wirtz, his name was. And he was just a few years from retirement. And so then he got me deferred for a couple years, and that did not work at all because I just done his grunt work, and he had a small farm, and it was great for him, but not for me, and there was no future there. So then I went in the Army. 1953, I went in the Army, and of course, you have to take tests. The first battery of tests we took, then there was some of us, we had to take the second battery of tests. And I got, my IQ was very high. Why, I don't know. But then I hadn't gone to college. Well, then after basic training, while I was in basic training, I applied for Officers Candidate School. And I got accepted, which I don't understand how, but I did. Because you're supposed to have X amount of college in order to get into Officers Candidate School. Well, then after basic training, there was no war at the time.
Because Korea was done by then.
Korea was done, and the Vietnam hadn't started up yet. So there was no, and I did not plan it that way, but it's just the way it happened.
Yep.
Because but anyhow, so then I thought, well, I'll be in a training unit and probably, go to some other country or whatever. That's what I planned on doing for the next 2 years or the year and a half, whatever I had left. But instead, they put me in operations in the infantry school in Fort Benning, and I was just out of place there because everybody else there had gone to college, and they had their expertise was much better, and their PR was a big thing at that time. You had the public relations.
Yep.
And of course, everybody else, it seemed like they had the education. And so one of them had his PhD already, and some had 2 years of college, some had, 1 or 3 or whatever. And so I was kind of the out of place, I guess you could say. I didn't fit in very well when I first started, but then things went very well for me, and I done my job good, and things went extremely well for me. I had perks up the wazoo, and I made more rank than anybody else in my time in the service. I got to be sergeant, and normally you couldn't do that in peacetime in 2 years. It was just, but I done well, and I got to do a lot of side work for the commanding general. I wound up sitting in on high echelon meetings. I just do peon type work. What would happen is he'd need someone to flip his chart,
Yep.
the charts or whatever. So that's what I would do. And at first it was kind of boring, but then it got very interesting and very, very interesting. And so I was not qualified for top secret, but I got in. I delivered papers for him once in a while if he'd need some papers to deliver. And so the military was very, very good to me. It was interesting, time went fast. And so I just lucked out, I guess. It was just plain luck.
Yep.
But
So
then I came home, and then I went, I worked at the slaughterhouse up at Swift's in South St. Paul.
were you living down here in
No,
Rush River at the time?
no, I was living up with,
Up in South St. Paul?
no, right up on top of the hill.
Oh, on top of the hill. Okay.
Yep.
So back then, I mean, today, to drive from Ellsworth to South St. Paul is only about a 35-minute drive, but it probably was the roads weren't what they are now. Back then, it was probably a good hour plus drive, wasn't it?
It wasn't too bad, but a lot of times we'd carpool, and it worked out pretty good most of the time. It didn't take long. It worked out good, and there was, but the pay was fantastic at that time.
So yeah, they were. People that don't know, the South St. Paul stockyards were the biggest union stockyards in the country.
Yes.
And Armour and Swift were both there.
Cuddy's and Swift and Armour's.
Yeah.
Then Cuddy went out first, and then Armour went out, and then Swift went out.
And the only thing left to even know is the Armour gates, I believe, are still...
Is that right?
Those big brick gates.
Yep, those big honking ones.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think Stan Bowles worked up there.
Oh, is that right?
Yep, for a while. But yeah, so you were working up there, which a meat cutter was a good job.
Oh, I didn't do meat cutting.
But
working. I worked in the hog department. In 55 is when I started. And in 54, there was a horrendous amount of corn. The country was just loaded with corn.
Yep.
And in 55, then the hogs come. The hogs came after the corn.
Yep.
And there was so many hogs that the price went down. Swift bought them at 9 cents a pound. That's what they paid for hogs at that time.
Yep.
And then they were way overweight. A lot of them, they were up to 300 pounds because everybody kept the hogs. They thought the price was going to go up. It didn't.
Yep.
And so most of the time it was around 10 cents, but I know one time it got down to 9 cents. Swift would get up to 20,000 hogs per day.
Really?
And it was just crazy. But they would speed up the lines. Of course, everything was these steel moving tables.
Yep.
And they would just, the meat would just fly through there.
Ha.
But they started, the hogs were killed. The slaughter was on the 5th floor. And by the time they got to the bottom, everything was all processed. And they had a good system.
Yeah.
It was old. It was not a newer type. They were talking about building a new one. But then we went on strike, which I thought was terrible. I did not vote for a strike. But anyhow, we went on strike. And I think it was twice, I think we went on strike. But then that ended it.
Well, yeah, because didn't Swift leave first and then Armour? Or Armour went and then Swift?
Well, Cuddy went first. I wasn't working there when Swift and Armour. I don't remember. I thought Swift went
because one of them went in the 80s, and then one was like late 60s or something like that, right?
Yeah, see, the one Swift went out, I think it was the 60s, I think they went out.
Okay.
I think it was in the 60s. But
You weren't up there then.
no, I was farming then. So
Okay.
after a couple of years, I worked up there a couple of years, and then I just farmed.
So then you were making pretty good money. Did you use that to kind of get a foot in to farm on your own?
Well, yeah, it helped me out a lot because the pay was good. And of course, we get laid off, you know, it seemed like all summer and stuff, which worked out okay.
Yep.
Because then I'd farm.
So then, your dad was up in that farm on top of the hill?
Yeah, he was out. Well, no, yeah, he was. Let's see, yeah, he'd have been gone by that time. He was retired.
So were you running the home farm then?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So then, when did you come down to the valley?
Okay. Well, I bought the place in after I got out of the Army. Then I purchased this 120. The 60 was just north of here. That just fit right in. Now I got 180 acres.
Okay.
So that's how. And then the buildings there were sold. Well, that was in 1944, 42. The flood, there was a huge flood, and that's what triggered him leaving here, and because it just destroyed the little workland that we did have. It destroyed about half of it, and so.
Okay, so you guys were down here and then moved up to the top of the hill.
Correct, yes.
So this was, down here would have been, was this your mom's home place?
Yes.
Down here?
No.
Oh, okay.
My mother lived up in El Paso.
Oh, okay.
So just north of on N. She grew up, okay, if you go out of El Paso, you know where N is? That goes up towards 20.
Be the Andersons up there and.
Yep. Roger Nichols lived up in there, and my mother lived just at the base of there's an incline that goes up past Anderson's.
Yep.
Right at the base, there's a little place. And the barn is on the one side of the road, and the house is on the other side. It's still there yet. The house has been, I think there's a second new house there since my grandmother lived there. But the barn was on the right side, and the house is on the left side. The barn is still there yet, because I remember back in the 30s, I'd go up and stay with my grandmother, and we'd pitch hay into I was probably 8, 9 years old, or 10, and we'd pitch hay into that old barn, and it's still there yet.
Huh.
The barn is still there. That's the only building that's left. But if you saw it, it's on the right-hand side, just going up that incline.
Okay. So how did they end up? Did they find this farm for sale down here when they lived down?
Well, see, my grandmother lived there, so my mother, she grew up there.
Yep.
And then when my dad got married, then he bought a place up by El Paso. Wayne, Murray. Wayne Murray. Do you know where he used to live? Bruce. I think Bruce lived up there too.
Okay.
I don't know. I got to ask Bruce about it sometime. But Wayne Murray, that was Bruce's dad. That was where the farm that my mother and dad lived on for a short while. And then 1930, they bought this place down here.
Okay.
So then they sold that one.
But the flood of 42, I've heard your son Donnie talk about that. That was supposed to have been, what was that? Was that like one of those 100-year?
Well, it was a big one, yes.
Was it a spring flood from the snow, or was it a?
No, it was spring.
Okay.
But it was from rain, a lot of rain.
Oh, okay.
And I forget how many inches of rain we had. And It wasn't the biggest flood. The biggest flood, I guess, was in 1895, because I talked to a fellow named Oscar Bill one time, and then the guy who used to own the Herald, what was it, Doolittle?
Okay.
I don't know if you heard about him or not, but he had the Pierce County Herald. He was telling me a lot of history. 1895, there was 3 dams on Rush River, and I guess there was a lot of rain came, and the first dam went out, then it came, hit the second dam, and that one went out, and the third one in, when the water surged, it hit the third one, and then she really came. I guess that was a bad one. It did a lot of changing, I guess. But then in 1942 was the next big one.
Okay.
And so 42 was, because I remember that very well, because we were in the house and we could hear things like tree logs and stuff hitting the house. It was in the first floor, and
Yep.
we were upstairs, and so it was not good. But,
Were the livestock okay? Did you get the
yep,
cattle?
the livestock, we had gotten them out, or my dad had gotten them out before the flood
Okay.
came. So otherwise, because the barn was lower than the house, and so the cattle would not have survived if they had been in there.
Yep.
We did lose quite a lot of chickens. I know and lost some pigs because they were, we couldn't get them out, of course, or they couldn't. But
So then when you bought, he had 120, you said?
this place was 120 originally,
Okay.
and the old farm that
Where you grew up?
I grew up was 60.
Oh, okay.
60 acres.
Okay. Did he keep that when he moved up to the top of the hill?
Yes, and then I bought it. I bought the place in 1950. Let's see, 40 or 50. Must have been 51 I bought the place.
Okay.
Well, first, there's some history there, too. My brother bought it first.
Ed?
Ed bought it, and he sold the house and the barn off, and they tore the other buildings down. And then I bought it from him. But then I didn't farm it or anything. I just bought it. And then I went in the Army, and then after I got out of the Army, of course, when I got out of the Army in 1955, then I bought this from Harold Waltz.
Okay.
This place, because he lived here then. Or no, well, he didn't. He had already moved off, but he owned the place yet. So then I bought it from him, and then it's history from there.
Well, in a valley farm like this I always thought that valley farms were probably better farmland, but back then, some of the land in the valley wasn't as good because they'd get sand veins from the river floods and stuff would kind of change the landscape some, right?
Well, see, like right here now, some of the land is very light, sandy soil, and so and we got some that's very productive.
Yep.
So we got extremes both ways.
Yeah.
And
but generally, these weren't the bigger farms. They tended to be smaller farms and tougher farming in the valley.
Yep.
So where your dad moved to, though, that was some really good land.
It was better land, yes.
Because that was, you look at Julius Hoopert was up in that neighborhood, and
yes,
really good land.
Yep, that was some of the best. Of course, Julius was a good farmer.
And a John Deere dealer, and
he had all the advantages, and he bought the farms cheap.
Yeah.
He would buy one farm after the next, and he just kept buying them and get them very, very reasonable.
Yeah.
Like right across from the main farm there, he paid, I think it was around $3,000 for that farm. That had to be at least 160 acres, maybe more than that.
I think it was 160.
But, yeah, and he got that. I think it was $3,000. And then the Herman Fisher farm, he bought that cheap. And yeah, he bought a lot of. Then over by Herbert, he
Yep.
bought land over there.
Yeah, because that's the stuff that Cyril ran.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
Okay.
And then Leo, of course, Julius set the boys up that wanted to farm. He set them up.
Yeah.
The boys, Leo, he bought that farm for Leo. You know, that's a nice farm there by the triangle. Then he gave Pete land over by Herbert. Well, of course, Pete didn't want to farm, I guess, so he left. And so, but then Cyril got the farm that what's his name lives on now?
Sheldon.
Sheldon, yeah. See, that was Cyril's.
Yep.
Julius gave that to Cyril.
Yeah.
So those boys, they had a head start.
Yeah.
They had a great start.
And they're good farmers.
Oh, you bet.
You
And then
know.
Chester, of course, he got the home farm.
Yep.
He got the home farm and the farm across the road. And
Yeah.
he got, that was a beautiful place.
Yeah, it was.
Yep.
That,
And so.
So then, you buy this place, and then you don't start farming right away here, though.
Nope.
Were you renting the land out?
No, I bought it in 1955, and then I started.
Okay.
1955, but the 60 acres, I owned that since, I think it was 51 I bought that.
So then,
52. It was 51 or 52.
So then when you quit working up there, did you start milking cows?
Yep, I don't remember exactly what year I started milking cows, but then, and the barn was old and stuff. It wasn't very good. So then I lost my arm in 70, I think it was 74. I guess I'm not sure.
So about your arm, yeah, you only have one. And what got that one?
Well, I had an Ellis Chalmers chopper, and the year that it was super dry and the corn was short, and did a dumb thing. I would pull the short stalks out and let her feed through. Well, evidently this one time it grabbed it too early and took my arm with it. So.
Because there's a lot of guys your age and younger that lost arms to corn pickers.
Oh, yes. Corn pickers were a big thing. Shredders, way back, corn shredders, they took a lot of arms.
Yeah.
Yep, yeah.
So
yeah, farming used to be a very, very dangerous occupation.
Well, how many cows were you milking?
Oh, we didn't have a lot. We only had probably 20, I think the highest we ever had was 27, 28 cows. That was it.
And then, so when you started milking, then after 55, you said.
Yep.
By that point, did you go to bulk milk right away, or were you still milking?
Yes, yeah.
You got a cooler right away.
Yep, yeah, I went to bulk.
And then did you have surge buckets then too,
Yep.
or?
Just had the surge buckets and stuff. I never really got into the pipeline or anything like that because it was coming into play at that time, but I hadn't, I was going to make some changes then. I had a few pigs. I'd raise about 100 hogs a year. And, well, I wouldn't raise that much, I'd sell some feeders. But
Did you have a step saver then, at least? Never.
I did not.
Carried the
milk. Yep.
What'd you have for a cooler?
I had Cherry Burrell.
Okay.
They were supposedly
They were an ice bank.
Yep. They had the ice bag. Yep. Yeah. It worked. I used to have problems with the pump. That was one of the big problems I had with it, but it wasn't too bad. Then after I quit milking, and then Annie started milking, then we got what kind was it? I can't even remember what kind it was then. But, well.
Well then, so 74, you're just farming.
Yep.
Then you lose your arm.
Yes. Yep.
So what did you do? I mean, your boys were old enough they could do chores, right? While you were healing,
Well, they
right?
were all in school. They were all in school. And see, I think Gene was he a freshman? Huh. Because I think, yeah, he must have been a freshman. I'd have to kind of piece it together, I guess. But I think he was a freshman in high school. But anyhow, then I sold the milk cows then, because I thought, well, I didn't have any. If I'd had all the, pipeline and everything else, then I probably would have. But the barn was old and everything, and so I thought, well, I'll just sell the cows, and that's what I done. And then I kept the heifers and still raised some pigs. And then I thought, well, I have to go off the farm and get another job because, well, Flossie didn't drive. She wasn't, and so she couldn't get a job. And the children were all young anyway, so Wayne was a baby.
Yep.
And so it worked out all right. Then I think, what year did I start at the bank? Then I went up to the bank and worked up there.
That was Pierce County Bank and Trust at the time.
Yeah,
right?
It was Ellsworth Bank, then Bank of Ellsworth, I think. Then it changed to Pierce County Bank.
Okay.
And but I went up there and started up there, and well, of course, I'd have made more money if I'd have went to McDonald's probably. But no, it worked out good. It worked out good. So.
When you started up there, did you start as a loan officer?
No, I worked in the back. But then I started and got into loan officer.
Were you, so then, what year did you start as a loan officer?
Well, I suppose it was about, I don't remember, probably.
80s?
No, it was in the 70s.
So then you're becoming a loan officer, which I'm guessing back then they probably didn't have, like today, if you're in ag lending, there's a special loan officer that only really does, ag loans and then commercial loans or whatever. You were probably just somebody wanted a car or somebody wanted a house.
No.
Or a farm, huh?
No, it was pretty much, it was specialized. They had one that took care of installment loans.
Okay.
The home installment loans.
Yep.
And then one was real estate. One took care of real estate. And that was Lee Skog. He done real estate.
Yep.
What's his name? Done the installments. And then there was Mel Oftendahl. He done the commercial.
Okay.
He done the commercial. And of course he'd do others too. And we all done some. We didn't completely stay in our line, but it was, we tried to, everybody have his own specialty.
Yep.
So even back then, and it worked out pretty well because I know Greg Burkle, he was installments. He was really good.
So then if it's 70s and you're getting into farm lending, that was pretty good times, for agriculture.
Well, it wasn't. The interest rate was so terribly high at that time. It was ridiculous. This was the problem.
Yeah, it took off. Well, under Carter with Paul Volcker, right?
Yeah, I guess I don't even remember now, but I know it was Carter and then
Reagan.
Reagan.
Yep.
But the interest rate was so high back then; it was just ridiculous.
But I bet you were pretty busy before the farm crisis with dairy. I bet guys were calling you all the time for silo unloaders and bunk feeders and pipelines, etc. Growing their dairy, from a 30 cow dairy to 50, 60 cow stuff, I imagine was pretty common at that time, right? Silos
Well,
getting
yeah.
built.
Of course, the one thing at that time, see, production credit was big in farm loaning.
I suppose.
And Federal Land Bank, they took care of real estate. They were big in real estate. Federal Land Bank, production credit, they took care of the chattels. And so they were big competitors for us.
Yeah, and I suppose, and for those that don't
And
know,
then FMHA.
yes.
FMHA was huge at the time.
Yeah, and for those that don't know, that FMHA today would be FSA, Farm Service Agency, and then PCA and FMHA, or PCA and Federal Land Bank became Farm Credit.
Yep.
Because people don't realize that, but PCA and Federal Land Bank actually went broke, basically, I think, at one point. That had to be reorganized, I believe.
Yes, Federal Land Bank. Of course, they were in business for a long time. They were way back in the 30s, 1930s. And there was a horrendous amount of farms were financed by Federal Land Bank.
Well, I believe Federal Land Bank, PCA, FMHA were, I believe, kind of formed. Weren't they kind of formed under the New Deal, maybe?
Well, see, the FMHA, of course, that was government.
Yeah.
That was a government agency.
Yep.
And I remember John, what was his name, that he was there for a long time. Oh, I can't. Well, anyway, but that was big because I know farm. If you were starting farming or they were having problems, you financed through FMHA.
They were supposed to be the lender of last resort.
Last resort. And what would happen sometimes, there would be people come in and ask, because they had to have a rejection. They had to be rejected by a normal or
lender.
A lender, yes. So what would happen is someone would come in and they'd say, well, I need a turn down.
Yeah.
They'd say, I want a turn down. Because, they wanted a
better interest rate.
Oh, fantastic. See, it went down to about 1 or 2%.
Yeah.
I mean, the bottom was. But they'd come in and they'd say, well, can you give me a rejection? Because I needed to go down to FMHA so that I can continue on. Well, probably 90% of the time you could.
Yep.
But then there was that 10%. Well, if, then you'd have to bring it before the loan committee and have them make a decision. Because I remember some cases where the guy was doing awfully good and he should not have been with FMHA. That's for the people that, really needed it.
Yep.
So then I'd bring it before the loan committee. Well, then they'd say, we'll take the loan. Well, then that FMHA booted them out then. Oh. So then they had to go, because someone else would take them.
Yep.
But FMHA was really good though. They would keep farmers, for a long time.
Yep.
They were good.
Well, the FMHA though eventually ended up in a lawsuit over during the farm crisis, they were foreclosing at higher percentage. Like there was more foreclosures per were higher through FMHA than it was anywhere else, and they were supposed to be the lender that was going to work with these guys.
But some of them were doomed in the first place.
Yeah,
I mean, it was a no-win situation. Some farmers should not have been farming, of course. And I shouldn't say anything like that, but they sometimes FMHA did not have any. They didn't have no recourse but to pull the plug. And of course, a lot of them. It was there was a time when it was really rough for farmers, just terribly rough.
80s. So the 80s were tough.
Yeah.
Were we a little better around here because of the dairy? Because the dairy stayed kind of somewhat profitable in the, over the years. It seems like dairy ended up getting a lot more volatile later, but dairy tended to be a pretty stable market, as far as.
Yes, a good dairy farmer, he came through it okay.
Yeah.
Yes. And then, of course, there was the farmers that were just excellent. They done everything right. They, or most things right. There was, but then there was a lot of farmers, and they got into situations. They maybe went to, they probably, I know there was some hog operations that really had problems, and of course the markets would fluctuate so much, and if you got into the pig business and the market went into the toilet, there was no getting out of it. I mean, you just lost your shirt.
Yeah.
And it probably wasn't. I know there was some big investments in pig operations.
Well, my parents' farm was one of them. There was a lot of money spent on that farm.
Yeah.
For expansion into hogs, and then actually I think in 91, that's when we remodeled, when Mom and Dad remodeled, and I think you probably worked with Dad on that through Pierce County Bank and Trust when we remodeled that in 91 and 92, somewhere in there, because Mom and Dad they worked together with Tom Lawton raising breeding stock.
Mm.
And but yeah, that farm there, boy, had been. I mean, I've seen the abstract of how much money was owed on that farm at one time, and it's not a little number today.
No, that's right. That's right.
Like it just, but that's what I was thinking when you think about the 70s. I look at the way the farms around here were affected by the 70s, as far as that's when the additions were put on barns. That's when silos were built. Like, you probably wrote up some loans for silos, I'm assuming, and
But yeah, it was a different time then, because of course silos were the big thing then. Like Weiser got into the silo business. He was putting up a lot of silos, and Harvester. They were putting up a lot of silos.
Yep.
Of course, they were big in dairy. There was a lot of changing times at that time that it was just, for some, it was just a catastrophe.
Yeah.
And it probably, some was self-inflicted and some it was not. Some of it was just situations that people got into. And it was just the timing was wrong, and the marketing changed so much. And of course, a lot of the farmers that went in they went from like 25, 30 cow herds up to 50, 60 cow herds, you know, and
Yeah.
they put up the big sows. There was big investments back then,
Yeah.
huge investments. And of course, some of them, they just couldn't weather it. But dairy was good at that time, though. It was fair. I mean, fairly good.
Yeah. Well, that was said the dairy farm because the dairy farm was your paycheck, your regular job. That was like having a regular job was the milk part of it, you know.
But it was labor intensive.
Yes.
But of course you supposedly got paid for your labor.
Yep.
And of course, like hogs, if you had a big hog setup, your workload shouldn't have been so high. But of course, then it was a volatile market.
Yes.
And it was like beef at that time. Beef operations, you know, if a guy had a big beef operation and he lost a calf or two, there was a few tears cried. You know, the tears came because a dairy farm, if you lost a calf, no big deal. The cow,
she still milks.
She milked like crazy, and there was no problem. But a beef was completely different.
That was a year wasted.
Yep, and sometimes the profit was so small.
Yes.
Like beef, it was not big. If you made a few dollars on one cow, just think if you lost one or two calves, it took away probably a half of your profit for the year.
Yeah.
It was a tough. Beef used to be tough.
So the dairy thing, there wasn't a lot of fluctuation in the milk price. For the most part, it
pretty much. There was some, but there was a period of time there the milk was just great.
Yeah.
$15 a hundred. I mean, it was much different than it is right now.
Yeah. And the price didn't seem to fluctuate. I mean, like a 25-cent change in the milk price was a fairly big deal.
Oh, yeah.
Where now, I mean, we've saw swings where it doubles in 1 year versus the last, and the volatility in it is just so hard. That's where I don't know if it was, I say maybe it was the putting milk on the CME, you know, was done in the 90s there when the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, because it used to be the milk price, you had a federal minimum price, and it was based off the distance you were from Green Bay, Wisconsin, which was the cheese exchange or whatever, I believe was how that used to work. But it used to irritate us that, you know, they'd be paying more money in California for milk than we are, you know, and but if you look back, you know, think back when you were, you know, milking cows, or even when you were working at the bank, did you ever picture there wouldn't be dairy farms everywhere around here?
Well, no, I guess not. I mean, as it evolved, then you could see what was happening, but that's after the fact, you know.
Yeah.
And I mean, you know, because when I grew up, every farm, if there was 40 acres, you had 10 cows, you know, 10, 12 cows, and you had a couple of pigs and so on. I mean, it was diversified, but it was so small, you know. And of course, there was a lot of debt at that time. There was, you know, a lot of that farms were bought for just about nothing. You know, it was so small. So the debt load was always very, very manageable, it seemed like. And I know it's just like now, you hear about Iowa. And I heard a report, I can't believe it, but they said that 80% of the farms in Iowa do have no debt. 80%. And it's just because of the one generation passes it on to the next generation and so on.
Yeah.
And of course now land down there, some of it sells such a crazy price, it's just ridiculous. You know, you hear $20,000 per acre.
Yeah.
And of course, some of that's just blended in with their operation.
Well, yeah, if you've got, 2,000 acres and an 80 comes up for sale next to you, you can spread that debt across 2,000 acres. Well, that ain't a big deal.
No, but it's not the right way of doing it, but it's done.
Yes.
And it is, and without no problem.
Yeah.
I mean, but normally you couldn't. If you bought that 2,000 acres and paid that kind of money, what would your interest rate be per acre on that?
Right.
On 20,000, even if you figured your land at 3%, you're paying such a horrendous amount of, for that land. It's ridiculous.
Well, and that's what's really kind of sad going forward is that when you were younger, you were able to buy a farm, a good sized farm, and work a job and pay for that farm when you started out.
Mm-hmm.
You'd need a hell of a job today to just buy a farm and pay for it. You know what I mean? Like we've lost opportunity, and that's the problem with a mature, as everything matures, agriculture matures, there's the bigger guy wants to continue to get bigger, and then the younger guy has to compete with that guy, and it drives the price up. And it used to be if a farmer was having hard times or something, well, maybe he could take an off-farm job to supplement that. Now, if somebody's a full-time farmer and they're struggling, you're not going to find a job good enough to even make a dent.
No, you can't. No.
It's just the numbers have gotten big, and
but see, here now is the problem with hobby farming. I mean, hobby farming is fine. I mean, it works, but you have to have some type of a niche in there that you can make it work. Right now, the average hobby farmer, if he works out and he just has the farm just to enjoy himself, he loves to farm, that's fine. But you've got to be really in control of that hobby farm. You have to control it. You have to be the one that you don't let it get away from you. You don't try to switch from hobby to the real thing. It used to be you could do that, but you can't do that anymore, I don't think. I know there's one operation that I remember, and it goes way back to when I was in the bank. This fellow worked out, and he started farming, and then he had some boys that were good. I mean, and they fit right in. He got bigger, and he went to full-time farming, and it worked, and it's working today with these boys. But like right now, if you got say you got an 80-acre farm, and how can you compete with the guy that's got 3,000 acres of corn? I mean, you can't, because first of all, you can't buy the seed, the fertilizer. You get much better deal if you're 3,000 acres versus the guy that's got 80 acres. You can't get, and then your equipment. How do you get that yield? That, are you going to pay $100,000, $125,000 for a corn planter to get that seed in there perfect and have the best yield? If you got a hobby farm, you can't do that unless you hire it done.
Yeah.
And of course, every situation is different, but most of the time, hobby farming is great, but you keep it as a hobby farm. You keep it in that level. I don't think, unless you get a special niche, there's special niches out there that works. But I don't know, your bigger farmers, your established farmers, I think they're the ones that are going to be the farmers down the road, and they're the ones that are going to succeed. But
I think what we need in this country is smaller livestock operations, because spread the livestock out. I think that would help younger, smaller farmers. But now we've consolidated the livestock so much with, all the dairy cows that are just in a few spots, and the hogs are just in a few spots, and, like,
But okay, well, I guess we can use this Ridge Breeze or whatever it's called up here. This operation are going to be 6,000 cows or something.
yeah,
I've seen some numbers, and I can't believe it, that they're talking $35 million for that operation now, and they're bonding what 17. It's crazy. Some of the figures I don't understand it at all, but it's just crazy. But if you get a farm like that, it can work. I mean, a lot of people say, well, it can't, but it can. Say, for example, let's actually use names here. Schroeder's.
yep,
They have land all over. They rent, lease land. They're good operators.
yep,
They're on top of everything, I think. Okay, if they rent a farm right next to Ridge Breeze and they sell the corn for silage, they'll get a premium for that because they're selling the stock and the corn.
yep,
Now it's right next to it, so they bring the fertilizer in. So now they don't have the stocks there, but they can bring the fertilizer in. And it's a win-win for both parties, isn't it? I mean, here they're getting a premium for it. They're marketing. They don't have to haul the grain to and store it or whatever.
yep,
Here they can just take it off the fields. They can put a green crop on there and still get it in there. They can knife in fertilizer from the dairy. Isn't that a win-win situation? Don't you think?
Well, I question whether or not how long before the dairy goes, if you're renting that land, what do I need you for? I'll just go right to the landowner.
About that. I think this operation, I think this is the way they operate is they don't have much land. I don't think they own a lot of land. Like up at Collins now, they own what, 160 acres maybe? That's about all they own.
I don't even think it's that.
Probably isn't. But of course, it's the whole, the land is going to take all the buildings and everything. It's going to absorb all that. They're not going to have one kernel of corn planted there.
Yeah.
But I don't know. It's it all depends. They're special. I think this place. I think they're specializing. They don't want to have machinery. They probably don't even want to have tanks to haul them, or they're going to hire somebody else. They're going to have somebody else do it for them, and all they're going to concentrate on is that milk, getting that, putting all their emphasis on the cows. But Fetzer's a different story. They got all that land, and of course, they sell grain and everything else because of their land and stuff. Of course, the other side of the coin, what's that land? What's the value of that land? Right now, land is going 10,000 an acre, right? And like Danny Fisher said, that's the norm now, is 10,000 acre, which is crazy. We got land here that's worthless. Worthless as tits on a boar pig, and it's worth so much money. It don't make sense. Don't make no sense at all.
I remember Terry Fisher telling me years ago as he was looking, we're up on, his farm up on top of the hill there, and looking towards Lost Creek Valley there. And he goes, I can remember and I could have bought any of that river bottom land. He says, $50 an acre.
Yeah.
And he says, why would I? He says, it didn't make very good cropland because, it sometimes it'd wash out or flood out, he goes, and then he says the pastures, he goes, well, he says a lot of trees and, and then the floods have wrecked the fence and everything else. So he goes, it just didn't seem like that'd be smart to buy. He says, and now all the the river bottom land, they want to sell it by the square foot, and people from the cities come out and put a little cabin next to it, and they, you know,
And then hunting.
yeah,
There's a guy just a short ways from here. He rents out his land for hunters, $3,000 just for, I don't know how many acres. It can't be very much, probably 40, 60 acres.
Yeah.
Oh, maybe more than that, probably 60, 80 acres. Gets $3,000 for that a year.
yeah,
And I mean, and he gets a break on the tax, you know.
yeah,
So it's, but, well, like, well, Barry Hager, you know Barry Hager, you know, he's made some offers on some neighbors that just unreal,
yeah.
you know.
Well, I can't believe in the last few years all the little cabins and these houses that have been built around the river.
Oh.
And
See, at one time, because I told this to one of the fellows that was by or lives here at the time, I said, you know, when we grew up here, this was very poor. There was super poor in the valleys because it seemed like, they just didn't have hardly anything. They were poor as church mice.
yep,
And so the more aggressive or more larger farmers on top of the hill, they considered us river rats. We were called river rats. And that, you know, and as kids, you know, it get kind of hurt a little bit, you know, when you were called a river rat, you know.
yep,
Because, you know, of the status of the, because of your location. You know, and of course it's just like the big cities the same way, you know, the slum areas and everything in the cities.
Yep.
Same thing. But then in the 40s, when the war started, of course, 90% of them left the area. This used to be just a mass of families living around this area. There was two across the river. There was two. They were kind of shacks. People lived there. Where Pam Hines lived, there was an old house there that was terrible. Then there was a little farm right across the river, between the river and the creek. That was just a very, very poor place. This place was probably a little bit better. And then there was a couple people that lived just right up the valley here. So those people living all over here.
yeah,
But they were all dirt poor. They were just dirt poor.
yeah,
You know, and of course then when the 40s come, they started, of course, there was the WPA, but then they went out and got good jobs.
yep,
And the work, labor, the employment was great. And then, of course, then after a while, the unions came in and things got really good. Because I know one, fellow lived right across the river here, and they were dirt poor. But then after he grew up and he left, he got a job at 3M and just done super well, you know. And he was telling me, you know, he says, it still hurts. He says, I could still think about, you know, how he was, you know, how they associated him with the area
yeah,
when he grew up. And of course, now he's successful. So, or
Yeah.
he's retired now and stuff. But that's the way it is, I guess.
yeah.
And but
Well, when you were, so you kept farming while you were working at the bank, right?
yeah.
Did you have beef cattle then?
No, I raised some Holstein heifers, and then Annie started milking. She milked her for quite a few years.
Yeah, when
Yes,
did
yeah.
she start doing that?
Well, I guess I can't remember. I can't remember the year. But yeah, she milked her for quite a while. And then I'd, you know, take care of of course, then she'd work out too. and milk cows. And then I'd take care of the feed and everything.
Yep.
And we had a pretty good situation here, but then of course before that there was years that we didn't milk cows or anything, so it wasn't as labor intensive, and the kids were growing up, so it wasn't bad. It worked out.
Yeah.
I guess it worked out okay.
And then eventually you kind of retired from the farming, and then your son-in-law
Yep.
started running it.
Yes. Yep.
And because your other sons, well, Donnie farmed with his wife.
Yep.
On her family farm.
Yep. Bellators. Yep.
And so then Don wanted to farm here then?
Yeah, Don Armstrong.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. He and of course he's been farming here quite a few years. I'm not involved at all in the farm anymore. And I have no interest. Of course, once you get older, things change, and it's not like it. I guess it's a normal. Well, I think everybody is different, but when you get old, of course your body changes, your mind changes, and everything changes, and so you can't remember stuff anymore, and it's the old body changes.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And the older you get, there was 6 of us the same age here 2 years ago, and now there's 3 of us left, and so now there's only Wayne Seifert and Bufford Curlymeyer and I were all the same.
Oh
age.
really?
Yeah. Wayne was born in October. I was born in September. Wayne was born in October. And then Bufford was born in November, 1st of November.
Okay.
So Bufford is about a little over a month younger than I am. And of course, I always used to call him the young kid, because he was, well, now I can't do it. Well, Bufford, he's same as we are, the rest of us. We're all the same, I guess.
When you guys all lived right around here.
Yep. Of course, Wayne is in the nursing home now.
Yep. But wasn't his farm up by Janish's?
Yep.
And then
Yep.
Bufford is up
Yep.
on the other side of the valley, kind of, right?
Yep. Well, yeah, Bufford, of course, him and Terry, they farmed together for a while. Then he, no, I don't think so. I don't think Buff ever farmed there. It was just Terry. But then, of course, Buff had the place out in County, what was it, County?
V. On County Road V, yeah.
He had it out there, and then he bought the place up here. Of course, I've known Buff since forever. So.
Yeah.
But yeah, he came down here a couple of weeks ago. Him and Marilyn came down. We had a good visit. But yeah, it's, you don't see as many people. And of course, the neighbors don't know them at all,
Yeah.
Of course, they're the different. I mean, they don't want to talk to me because, I'm not, everybody's, you grow up and you're in a certain category. How do you say it? If somebody's actively working, well, he's completely different than we are, and they got different thoughts and different views, and so you kind of lose the social.
Yeah.
Social life is different than.
Well, farmers kind of stuck together because they had similar lives, similar interests, but
they're gone too now.
Yeah, they're.
I don't have anybody my age around here anymore, and like Wayne, I haven't even been up to see him. I don't know. I guess I should. I don't know how he's doing. Of course, it used to be Clarence. Clarence and I, we were the old people that lived here forever.
Yeah.
And then, of course, like Clarence, he went to the nursing home. That kind of, well, when he went to the nursing home, that kind of, he went downhill fast. And I mean, he lost all the interest in, because him and I, we could bullshit forever. You know?
Yeah.
And we enjoyed each other's company and everything.
And your brother Ed lived.
Yep, of course, he's been gone a long time now
Yeah.
too. You know, I don't have any siblings left now. So.
Yep.
And yeah, it's kind of interesting. One thing that I always thought was kind of interesting. I had two uncles, and one of them lived a hard life. He had a big family, and he had a hard life. He lived a hard life. And he started smoking when he was 16 years old. And I had another uncle he lived as straight as an arrow. He was very religious. He never smoked, drank. He lived here until 1942, and then he moved out to Oregon. And he used to draft. He loved the orchards, fruit trees. He'd graft fruit trees and stuff. And he had several acres out there right near Portland. But anyhow, he lived really good. He had a wife that was just fantastic. They had two boys. So, okay, now what do you think how old do you think they both lived to be? What was the difference in their longevity?
Well, I'm guessing the one that you would have bet against is the one that lived the longest, huh?
Well, he lived when he was 92. They made him quit smoking at 92 because he lived by himself. So then he'd get kids to bring him in cigarettes. Well, then he had to go into a nursing home. By 93 or 94, he went in a nursing home. He died at 95. My other uncle, same thing. He died at 95. They both died at 95.
Really?
Completely opposites. And they both lived exactly the same age. So I don't know. It's kind of tough to figure out. And of course, I think, of course, that felt that the genes have a lot to do with it, or some to do with it.
Yes.
I mean, true, the way you live your life makes some difference, but the genes make a lot of difference.
Yeah.
But, well, it's, yeah, I know Uncle Helmer. Well, I'll tell you what, he hauled canned milk.
Yep.
Since 40s to Helmer Peterson, his name was. And he hauled, and he brought the last can of milk into Elser Creamery. He was the last one. And so then his customers either had to quit, well, they had, I guess O'Galley, I think O'Galley had cans yet, or it was some
Okay.
other. So then they did pick up the milk where, the patrons that he had. And then some of them went to bulk, and then some quit.
Yep.
So it was, but he had the distinction of having the last, hauling in the last cans at Elser Creamery.
Huh.
So, but no, he used to work for Federal Land Bank way back in the 30s. He worked for Federal Land Bank, and Federal Land Bank took a lot of farms back, or they acquired a lot of farms, and so then he would go in there and they would have a crew, and they'd go in there and fix the farms up, the barns and everything, and then they'd resell them then after they had gotten them back. So that was that's what he'd done for a long time.
Okay. And
then he hauled milk, and of course at the one time it was pretty good. It was pretty good at one time because, it was all cans at that time when he started.
Yeah.
But yeah. So yeah, it.
Seen a lot of. You've seen a lot in 95 years or 94 years.
Well, yes, I have seen a lot of changes.
Yeah.
The airplane, you know, but still, I remember the airplane. You know, you'd see the airplanes fly over, you know, and of course you didn't see the big commercial ones when I was small, but there was where Everett Mulhausen lives now.
Yep.
There was a guy there that had an airplane, and that was this is back in the 40s, early 40s.
Really?
Yep, yep, he had an airplane. I don't remember what his name was or anything, but and of course when I graduated from high school, you know, there was some of the guys I went to school with. You could get your license back then, 40 hours, and you had your license. You had 40 hours. It didn't take much to get your pilot license, you know, for just small planes.
Yep.
And then of course, then when the military, there's a lot of guys in the Army at that time. They became pilots, you know, and some of them, after they got out of service, they flew commercial.
Yep.
But then there was such a flood of pilots that a lot of them couldn't get a job.
Yeah.
Whatchamacallit, Swanson down there, what was his name? Vernon Swanson, I think.
Yeah.
It was.
Larry and Vernon farmed together.
Yeah. Well, Vernon was a pilot.
Really?
Yep, in the Army. And he was he wanted to get into commercial, but then it didn't work. And then, of course, then he got into farming and other things. And so
Yep.
then it worked out for him.
Oh, yeah.
But, yeah. Well, Larry still farms, doesn't he?
Oh, yeah. Larry and his sons, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, he went on to do pretty well farming. You know, they started that, you know, that chemical and supply business and stuff down there, or deep land supply or whatever. Yeah.
Of course, Schroeder's down there too, isn't he? He's pretty good size too, isn't he?
Yep.
Bernard?
Yep. Bernard. And Bernard used to milk cows right up over here, right? Growing up, he kind of helped, wasn't it, one of the Hineses?
Oh, is that right? Of course, Vernon, you know, he still lives up there. He had his brother.
Yeah.
Still lives right up there, right by 72. Yeah.
So, yeah.
No, it was, I knew a kid I went to school with, and when I was just out of high school a short while, and he was kind of a screwball, but then he had his license, and so I went up with him, and I don't know, I was thinking at the time, you know, is this going to be a good venture or not? You know? But we got up in the air, and he said, "Do you want to fly?" And I said, "Well, I don't know." He says, "I'll teach you how." So, of course, flying on these little planes, it's nothing to it. They're easier than a vehicle, you know, up in the air. You know, landing and taking off, that's a little different story. But when you're up in the air, there's just nothing. So I was flying around. I kind of enjoyed it. But it is really, but I guess the big thing is landing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
So, all right. Well, thanks, Phil.